There comes a quiet and invisible turning point in the life of an empath. A moment when they no longer choose chaos disguised as connection, but peace rooted in emotional intelligence. It is not dramatic. It is not loud. It is a deeply conscious shift from emotional survival to emotional mastery. This moment is not about rejecting people. It is about reclaiming the self. For years, the empath has lived with a heightened sensitivity that feels both like a gift and a burden. They walk into a room and instantly register subtle shifts in tone, posture, silence. Their brain is constantly decoding emotional data, micro-expressions, sighs, pauses between words. This sensitivity is deeply connected to emotional intelligence, a concept widely explored by Daniel Goleman, who emphasizes that self-awareness is the foundation of psychological strength. Yet for many empaths, awareness of others develops long before awareness of self. The awakening begins quietly. It often arrives through exhaustion. The empath notices that after certain conversations, their body feels heavy. After certain relationships, their thoughts become restless. They replay interactions, wondering what they could have done differently, how they might fix what was never theirs to repair. Slowly, a new awareness forms, not about others, but about their own internal state. They begin to observe patterns. They notice how often they anticipate someone else's needs while dismissing their own. They see how quickly they step in to soothe discomfort, even when no one asked them to. Their empathy, once automatic, starts to feel like emotional overextension. They recognize that constantly absorbing others' emotions has blurred the boundary between compassion and self-neglect. Neuroscience tells us that repeated emotional stress keeps the brain's threat system activated. The empath realizes their nervous system has been living in quiet hypervigilance, scanning for tension, preparing to respond. What once felt like kindness now feels like survival conditioning. This insight is transformative. Instead of asking how they can help someone else, they begin asking what they are feeling right now in the present moment. It validates their own emotional landscape as worthy of care. They understand that empathy without self-regulation leads to burnout. They begin distinguishing between feeling someone's pain and taking responsibility for it. The guilt that once followed every boundary starts to weaken. This awakening is not dramatic. It is cognitive clarity. It is recognizing that emotional generosity must be balanced with emotional preservation. In this moment, the empath stops measuring love by endurance and starts measuring it by alignment. Loyalty has always been one of the empath's strongest traits. They stay when others leave. They defend when others criticize. They forgive long after apologies stop coming. At first glance, this seems noble, even admirable. But emotional intelligence, as emphasized by Daniel Goleman, teaches that maturity is not measured by how much we tolerate, but by how well we regulate and protect our emotional energy. The empath begins to notice a subtle imbalance in their relationships. They are often the listener, rarely the one being heard. They are the emotional support system, yet their own struggles feel minimized or misunderstood. Slowly they realize that loyalty without reciprocity becomes self-sacrifice. This realization does not make them cynical. It makes them discerning. They start redefining what loyalty truly means. It is no longer about staying through dysfunction or proving devotion through endurance. It becomes about mutual respect, consistent effort, and emotional safety. They understand that healthy relationships are not built on one person's capacity to absorb discomfort. Boundaries enter the picture not as rigid walls, but as clear emotional guidelines. The empath learns to pause before automatically agreeing. They allow themselves to say that they need time or that something does not work for them without spiraling into guilt. This is unfamiliar territory for someone used to pleasing others. Asserting needs can feel uncomfortable at first. But discomfort is not danger. It is growth. Psychologically, this shift reflects stronger self-concept and internal validation. Instead of seeking approval through availability, the empath begins valuing balance. They observe who respects their limits and who resists them. That observation becomes data. Patterns reveal themselves. In redefining loyalty, the empath stops equating love with self-abandonment. They recognize that staying in emotionally draining dynamics does not prove depth. It erodes identity. Loyalty becomes selective, intentional, grounded in self-respect rather than fear of loss. Peace becomes tangible when the empath begins to understand the biology behind their exhaustion. Emotional sensitivity is not only psychological, it is physiological. The body keeps score. Prolonged exposure to tension, unpredictability, or emotional volatility activates the stress response system. Cortisol rises, the heart rate subtly increases, muscles remain slightly contracted. Over time, this constant activation becomes normalized, even though it quietly drains vitality. Drawing again from principles associated with emotional intelligence and regulation discussed by Daniel Goleman, the empath realizes that managing emotions also means managing environments. They begin to notice how certain people leave them feeling calm and expanded, while others trigger tightness in the chest or mental fog. Instead of dismissing these signals, they start respecting them as data from the nervous system. This is a profound shift. Rather than intellectualizing every interaction, they tune into bodily cues. A headache after a conversation, fatigue after repeated exposure to negativity, restlessness before meeting someone who thrives on drama. These sensations are no longer ignored, they are interpreted. The empath understands that their body is not overreacting, it is communicating. They start making quieter choices, spending more time in spaces that feel predictable and grounded, limiting exposure to chaotic personalities, choosing silence over constant stimulation, prioritizing sleep, solitude, and restorative activities without labeling them as selfish. What once felt like withdrawal now feels like regulation. There is also a release of responsibility. The empath recognizes that they cannot stabilize every emotional storm around them. They are not required to mediate every conflict or soothe every insecurity. By stepping back, they allow others to confront their own emotional patterns. This creates space both physically and psychologically. Calm stops feeling unfamiliar. It becomes desirable. The nervous system begins to settle, shifting from survival mode into a state of balance. The empath discovers that peace is not the absence of care. It is the presence of internal safety. One of the most defining aspects of this transformation is how quietly it happens. When the empath finally begins to detach from the things, the situations, and the people that disrupt their inner stability, this profound shift is not fueled by anger, and it is certainly not driven by a desire for revenge. Instead, this quiet withdrawal is guided entirely by a newfound sense of internal alignment. If we look back at the earlier phases of their life, we can see that they may have tried to explain themselves over and over again. They spent so much of their precious time and energy hoping that if they could just provide enough clarity, that clarity would eventually create some sort of meaningful change in the other person. They would constantly over-articulate their deepest feelings. They felt the desperate need to justify their boundaries, almost apologizing for having them. And they attempted to be seen and understood at absolutely all costs, even if it meant sacrificing their own peace of mind. But as time passes, emotional maturity naturally introduces a completely new realization. It is a quiet but powerful understanding that simply says, not everyone in this world is actually committed to understanding you. Drawing inspiration from the deeper dimensions of emotional intelligence, a subject so thoroughly explored by experts like Daniel Goleman, the empath starts truly recognizing that their emotional energy is not a limitless resource. It is finite, and it must be fiercely protected. They start to see that every single argument, every exhaustive attempt to prove their own sincerity, and every desperate effort to repair the things that other people continually break carries a very real and heavy psychological price. The cost is simply too high. Because of this, they begin asking themselves an entirely different question. They no longer look at a broken situation and ask how they can fix it. Instead, they look inward and ask if this dynamic is truly aligned with the person they are actively becoming. Letting go of someone or something without harboring any hatred in your heart requires a truly remarkable level of emotional self-regulation. The empath, having learned from past cycles of pain, actively resists the familiar temptation to dramatize their exit from a toxic situation. In this new phase of their journey, there are absolutely no explosive confrontations. There are no loud, public declarations of their departure. Instead of all that noise, there is simply a slow, steady, and gradual disengagement. They consciously stop volunteering their emotional labor for people who do not appreciate it. They purposefully shorten the length of any conversations that constantly revolve around negativity and draining drama. They gracefully decline the social invitations that feel like heavy obligations rather than genuine opportunities for connection. In a very real way, their quiet absence becomes their strongest boundary. Of course, it is important to acknowledge that there is a deep sense of grief involved in this delicate process. Empaths are people who inherently invest deeply in their relationships, and because of this, the act of detachment can often feel like carefully cutting through thick layers of shared memories and all of those beautiful, imagined futures that will now never come to pass. But the difference now is that they actively allow themselves to feel that sadness fully, and they do so without turning that sorrow inward and transforming it into toxic self-blame. They possess the profound understanding that simply mourning the loss of a connection does not mean they have to return to it. They can miss a person while still knowing that walking away was the absolute right choice to make. This particular stage of their journey reflects an incredibly powerful cognitive shift. They realize that genuine closure does not always require a final confrontation with the other person. Sometimes, the most important clarity is completely internal. The empath finally releases that deep-seated need to be validated by the very people who actually benefit from misunderstanding them. They come to a place of peaceful acceptance, recognizing that some relationships in this lifetime merely functioned as temporary lessons rather than permanent, lifelong alignments. In making the conscious choice to walk away with quiet composure rather than burning resentment, the empath successfully protects their own emotional integrity. They no longer feel the need to carry anger around as some sort of misguided proof of their strength. Instead, they choose to carry their inner calm as undeniable evidence of their personal growth. For so much of their life leading up to this transformative point, the empath's very identity has been deeply, almost inextricably, intertwined with the feeling of being needed by others. In almost every group setting or family dynamic, they automatically became the dedicated mediator in the middle of messy conflicts. They were always the dependable late-night listener for friends in distress. They were always the highly observant one who could instantly sense another person's unspoken pain, and they were always the very first one who rushed in to try and soften that blow. Over a long period of time, continually playing this caretaking role became so much more than just a behavioral habit. It actually became the core of their self-definition. Deep down, their fundamental sense of personal value felt directly connected to their perceived usefulness to the people around them. When the people in their life were happy and stable, the empath felt a vague sense of purpose. But when those same people were actively spiraling in a chaotic crisis, the empath felt entirely indispensable. They felt like they mattered most when things were falling apart. However, as their emotional awareness steadily deepens and expands, a process that is very strongly aligned with the well-established frameworks of self-mastery and emotional intelligence described by Daniel Goleman, the empath slowly begins questioning the very foundation of this caretaker identity. They start to look in the mirror and ask themselves exactly who they are outside of constantly providing emotional labor. They ponder a very deep and sometimes intimidating question. They wonder, if absolutely no one in my life needed saving, if no one needed fixing, and if no situation required my stabilizing energy, what exactly would remain of me? When they first truly confront this question, it can honestly feel incredibly disorienting and perhaps even a little frightening. For the first time in a very long time, without the constant, heavy weight of external demands pressing down on them, there is simply silence. And it is precisely within that unfamiliar, quiet space that the empath finally encounters all the beautiful, vibrant parts of themselves that have been long postponed and pushed to the side. They rediscover their own dormant creativity. They reconnect with their natural curiosity about the world. They begin to feel the stirrings of their own personal ambition, and perhaps most importantly, they finally allow themselves to experience genuine, unapologetic rest. Sit in this quiet reflection, they begin to realize just how often their own personal goals, dreams, and desires were indefinitely delayed simply because someone else in their orbit required their immediate attention and energy. They start to notice just how frequently and how automatically they had always adjusted their own personality, their moods, and their opinions just to perfectly match the emotional climate of whatever room they walked into. They understand now that reclaiming their true identity means actively allowing their own raw authenticity to finally replace their lifelong habit of constant adaptation. The empath makes the conscious decision to completely stop shape-shifting just for the sake of maintaining a false sense of harmony with others. They begin to bravely express their own personal preferences, and they do so without anxiously scanning the room to make sure everyone else approves of their choice. They start to passionately pursue their own unique interests, and they do this without constantly calculating how those interests might be used to serve or benefit someone else. They learn to do things simply because it brings them genuine joy. This monumental shift in their way of living is subtle on the outside, but it is absolutely profound on the inside. Day by day, they are actively moving away from being defined by external forces and the opinions of others, and they are transitioning into a life that is entirely internally directed and guided by their own true north. Along with this beautiful transition, there is also a massive strengthening of their own fundamental self-respect. Instead of constantly trying to earn their validation by sacrificing their own needs on the altar of someone else's happiness, they begin cultivating a deep sense of worthiness through their own inner alignment and self-love. They take the time to truly acknowledge their own unique strengths, their talents, and their gifts, and they manage to do this without automatically tying those qualities exclusively to their ability to provide care for others. Empathy absolutely remains a core, defining trait of their beautiful personality, but it is no longer the sole currency they use to buy love and acceptance in the world. This profound reclamation of their own energy naturally fosters a deep, unshakable confidence within them. Making choices and decisions suddenly becomes so much clearer and easier than it used to be. This clarity happens because their choices are no longer being heavily filtered through the exhausting, anxiety-inducing question of how their actions will affect every single other person around them. Instead, their decisions are now guided by a much simpler, much healthier question. They simply ask if this choice accurately reflects the person that they are actively becoming. By courageously stepping far beyond the limiting role of being the world's constant caretaker, the empath ultimately discovers a much fuller, richer, and more vibrant identity. It is an identity that absolutely still includes an immense amount of love and compassion for others, but it is an identity that is no longer strictly confined or limited by it. This incredible inner transformation slowly begins to stabilize and become their new normal way of existing. Something truly unexpected and beautiful begins to happen in their external reality. The empath's entire relational world, the types of friendships, partnerships, and connections they have, starts to fundamentally change. This does not happen because they are out there aggressively trying to attract different kinds of people into their life. Rather, it happens simply because their own internal emotional frequency has completely shifted to a higher, much healthier vibration. The deep principles of emotional intelligence, a comprehensive framework that has been articulated so extensively by Daniel Goleman, heavily suggests that our capacity for self-regulation and our level of self-awareness directly and powerfully influence the overall quality of our social interactions. This proves to be incredibly true for the empath. When the empath finally becomes more deeply grounded in their own authentic energy, their personal standards for who they allow into their space naturally and subtly begin to rise. They find that they are no longer instantly magnetized by pure emotional intensity alone. If you look back at their past, the chaotic emotional highs, the roller coaster dynamics, and the dramatic displays of unhealed vulnerability may have easily been mistaken for genuine connection and profound depth. They used to think that the chaos meant it was real. But now, in this new state of awareness, quiet, peaceful consistency actually feels so much deeper to them. They realize that emotional predictability from the people they care about does not mean a relationship is boring. Instead, that beautiful predictability simply feels infinitely safer and far more nurturing to their delicate nervous system. Because of this newfound need for safety and peace, they naturally start placing a much higher value on the kind of people who know how to communicate clearly and honestly. They gravitate toward individuals who inherently respect personal boundaries without making a fuss. And most importantly, they seek out people who are fully willing to take complete responsibility for their own emotional states. Simply put, the exhausting chaos that used to draw them in completely loses its former appeal. It is very important to understand that this shift is not at all about the empath becoming overly selective out of some false sense of arrogance or superiority over others. It is entirely about finding genuine, healthy resonance with the right kinds of souls. When the empath finally reaches the point where they no longer feel the burning need to over-explain themselves, when they stop over giving their precious energy to those who take it for granted, and when they absolutely refuse to overfunction in order to keep a toxic dynamic afloat, a natural pruning process occurs. The people in their life who heavily relied on the empath's excess energy to survive will slowly and gradually begin to drift away from them. And what remains after this natural falling away, or the beautiful new connections that begin to enter their life during this phase, are strictly individuals who actively operate from a strong place of personal, emotional accountability. When the empath interacts with these people, the conversations always feel wonderfully balanced and entirely reciprocal. The quiet moments of silence between them finally feel deeply comfortable and restorative, rather than feeling tense, heavy, and full of unspoken expectations. Even when there are natural disagreements, which happen in all human connections, those small conflicts do not immediately threaten the underlying bond of the relationship. Alongside this shift in their social circles, the empath also becomes noticeably less reactive in their day-to-day life. In the past, if someone was upset, the empath would instantly absorb that negative energy like a sponge. But now, instead of absorbing another person's anger, frustration, or sadness, they simply learn how to peacefully observe it from a safe, detached distance. Instead of immediately rushing in with a desperate need to soothe someone else's triggered insecurity, they learn to bravely step back and allow that person the necessary space to achieve their own self-resolution. This incredibly powerful shift in behavior naturally creates far healthier dynamics across the board because it completely removes the toxic imbalance of one-sided emotional labor that used to define the empath's life. As a direct result, all of their relationships begin to feel significantly lighter and much more joyful. This is not because these new connections somehow lack depth or seriousness, but simply because they completely lack the suffocating weight of codependency and emotional dependency. The way the empath experiences and builds trust also develops very differently in this new chapter of their life. Trust is no longer blindly given away based on hopeful words or grand declarations. Instead, it is slowly and carefully built over time, based entirely on consistent patterns of behavior rather than empty promises. The empath pays very close attention to how a person actually acts, prioritizing their behavior far above whatever words they happen to speak. They absolutely no longer waste their time blindly, chasing the imaginary potential of who a person could be if they just healed. Instead, they choose to only respond to the consistency of who that person is right now in the present moment. This brilliant level of emotional discernment acts as an incredibly powerful filter for their life. It works quietly behind the scenes, naturally aligning them with the specific kind of people who are genuinely capable of offering mutual respect, deep understanding, and reciprocal love. In ultimately making the brave decision to choose their own internal peace over simply keeping people around to avoid feeling abandoned, the empath finds a beautiful truth. They discover that they ultimately do not end up alone in the world. Instead, they end up perfectly aligned. They end up surrounded, not by a draining crowd of broken people who desperately need to be saved, but by a supportive, loving circle of strong individuals who truly know how to stand as equals right beside them.